Hello everyone. In this video we're going to quickly cover some 101 on CSS Grid. So firstly, what is it? Well, essentially CSS Grid is a fairly new layout mode that has been adopted in browsers over the last year or so almost 2 years. It's known as being a two-dimensional layout mode, meaning that for a single parent element we can define both rows and columns. And the result of doing this creates a collection of cells that child elements can be placed into. And that is actually the primary focus of this layout, being able to specify exactly where children should be placed inside of this new grid element. Now, children can be placed inside of this grid layout in a number of different ways, and we'll see more of that in an upcoming slide. It's highly customizable, meaning that we can actually configure how many columns and rows a grid can have, as well as the potential widths and heights of those respectively. And configuring these widths and heights can be done on a per column and per row basis. It fixes a lot of layout problems that Flexbox could not fix, with the main one being the problem of having to nest HTML just to achieve certain layout designs. CSS Grid allows us to flatten our HTML and reduce the amount of nesting needed to build these layouts. And where it really shines is in regards to responsive web design. We can completely move items around our grid based on the size of the viewport of our device. And we can actually achieve this with very little CSS compared to what we used to need. In the past, if we wanted to move elements around the screen, we would have to write float hacks or change elements from block to inline and vice versa, or even worse, implement positioning and take elements out of document flow. Now all we need to do is redefine our grid system in our media queries, changing the number of rows and columns if needed, and then reposition all the children inside of that grid, exactly where we want them to be. We'll understand how this works as well in future videos. And lastly, if you read the W3C documentation, CSS Grid will be referred to as the CSS Grid layout module. Also understand that the documentation also indicates that this layout mode is still at the level 1 candidate recommendation step, which I won't explain exactly what that means, but just basically understand that the publication is in its early days and hasn't been completely finalized. Now, this all sounds great in theory, but the best way to truly understand and appreciate what CSS Grid can do for you is by looking at a problem. So what you see in front of you right now is my sample chat application that we'll be building at some point later in the course. And if you've taken my Flexbox in-depth course before, you may remember this app from there as well. Now, before CSS Grid, we would probably break this app down into two major areas to start off with. You would have the sidebar that contains all the conversation features, and then you would have the main chat window area that contains all the chat features. Then you would subsequently look at the sidebar and break that down further into three child areas. One for the conversation search, another one for the conversation list area, and then finally one for the add conversation button at the very bottom. You would then look at the chat area and probably do exactly the same thing, breaking it down into chat title, chat message list, and chat form respectively. Now here's the thing. Without any form of a grid system, we would most likely perform some form of nesting here to get all the conversation features into the sidebar and to get all the chat features into the chat area. Then after we've even done that, we then have to play around with the heights of all these elements so that everything lines up correctly next to each other. But what if we had the ability to flatten this behavior and implement it similar to how we would design it in, say, Photoshop or some other kind of design software? Designers think about designing UIs using a grid system, specifying their own rows and columns. They would then proceed to lay out the individual elements within this grid system. Now, if we take a look at this application closely, we can easily define a grid for this and lay out the features exactly where we want them. To get a better idea of what I mean, if I show you this, you can easily see this app can be broken into 2 columns and 3 rows. And then all we have to worry about is defining these rows and columns exactly the sizes they need to be, and then just place the items, therefore in this case the features, in their appropriate places. So we can say that the search conversation feature could be in spot number 1, say, in the top left, and then we could have the conversation list area in spot 2, directly underneath that, and then the add conversation feature in, say, spot 3, chat title in spot 4, chat messages list in spot 5, and finally the chat form in spot 6. By doing this, our chat application has been reduced to 1 parent element and 6 children, which is much simpler to work with. Now this is already cool, but guess what? It gets even better, because as I mentioned earlier, that CSS Grid is really helpful with responsive web design. So let's look at an example of this as well. So what I have on my screen right now is a YouTube clone application that we'll also be building later in this course. And this is how it would look on mobile in portrait mode. Here's another view of the same application if we flipped over our mobile and viewed it in landscape mode. Notice there are 2 differences here. The first one is that the comments section is moved up to be above the related video section. Now this is in fact in the original portrait mode view, it's just we can't see it because it's below the related videos. The second thing that's changed is that the related videos has gone from showing a single column to showing 2 columns. Now if you're watching this, you're probably saying that's nothing special because we can do this kind of thing already, and you're right. But with CSS Grid, we can do this even easier, and I'll show you how we're going to do that in a later video in this course. Now we move into portrait mode for the tablet, and not much has changed here. We just have the 3 columns for the related videos now instead of 2, so there isn't much more to point out here. However, when I flip the tablet over and look at the device in landscape mode, you're going to see a significant change in the layout of the application. The related videos has now not only gone back to a single column again, but it's also moved completely off to the side and now spans across all the content in the application. Now let's think about what we would have to do without a grid system to get this sidebar working exactly as expected. We'd either have to mess around with positioning, taking the related videos out of document flow, and then pinning it to the right like this. Or we could write some flashy JavaScript to move elements around so that we could create this second column. In either case, we're having to hack to get this to work. Now once again, let's view this as a designer would. You would probably have 2 different designs for this application representing the change in layout. And for the first 3 designs, a designer would probably have a grid system that contains a single column followed by 5 rows. So say something like this. Now it's possible that they may have a third template for the change of bringing the comments up, but the point is that the number of rows and columns are the same here, and just some of the row heights require adjusting. Now for the last design, you would probably have a 2-column layout with 4 rows, and the related video section would be placed in the second column and then be told to span all rows in the design. So something like this. Now once again, with a flattened grid system, you can see how much easier it would be to achieve this design compared to how we used to have to do it. So now that we understand what CSS Grid is and what problem it solves, let's quickly cover some terminology. So as already mentioned, we start off with 1 parent element, and this parent element is known as a grid container. We tell this grid container how many rows we want and how many columns we want, and the sizes of these rows and columns. Now just for simplicity in the diagram, I've made all rows and columns the same size, but just know that this is configurable. Now if you're still not sure what a column or row looks like in this grid, that's a column and that's a row. Now whether we are talking about columns or rows of this nature, in the CSS Grid world, we refer to these as grid tracks. Now as you will see in future videos, we don't necessarily talk about the width of a column or the height of a row. We are more likely to say the size of a grid track. So just keep that in mind. Now, on either side of the grid tracks are special virtual lines, and these lines are present both vertically and horizontally based on the illustration we have here. These are called, yes, you guessed it, grid lines. Grid lines are essentially used as guides to determine where elements can be placed inside our grid. Now, there's a little bit more to it than that, but for now, let's just leave it at that, and we'll cover more on this later in the course. We then have the concept of an individual cell, which is a result of two grid tracks intersecting, like this. This is known as, once again, you've probably guessed it, a grid cell. Another concept that we talk about as well is the grid area. A grid area is essentially just a collection of adjacent grid cells in your grid, and grid areas can be of different sizes. In this example, it's 3 by 3, but it could easily have been 1 by 4 or 2 by 3, and so on. Now, everything we've spoken about so far is about the grid container, the element that is being configured. But what about the child elements that are actually fitting into this grid? Well, firstly, a child element in a grid is known as a grid item. These grid items can be placed into our grid in a number of different ways. We can have a grid item that fits into an individual cell, like the one you see on screen right now, or it can span multiple columns. It can span multiple rows. It could just span all columns, taking up an entire row. It can also span across all rows and take up an entire column. And as you can see, it can actually float over the top of others as well. And lastly, we can have items fill a grid area just like the one you see on screen now. And this is why the CSS grid layout is so flexible, because we have so many options. Now, the last thing I want to show before we move on is spacing. So here is another grid, and as you can see, it has a lot of space between each grid track. This type of spacing is known as a grid gap. Now, as you will see later in the course, these grid gaps are configurable for either all columns, all rows, or both. You can't, however, configure an individual gap size between two tracks. So that's just something to keep in mind. Okay, so now that we know all the terminology, I just want to talk about one more thing in this video, and that is browser support. Basically, except for Internet Explorer, CSS Grid seems to work well in most of the modern browsers we care about, as long as you're using a version that has been released within the last year or so. So just a quick disclaimer as well, I'm not going to say that all my material in this course works in every single browser, but I will say that it should work on most of them, as long as the browser has proper support. I have tested most of my examples in most of the modern browsers, and they seem to be fine, but just understand that I may have missed a few things. Also keep in mind that this layout mode is still evolving, and as a result of that, there may be a chance that some of my examples may no longer work, as intended anyway. And if that's the case and you happen to be watching the video, please let me know, give me a shout out, and I'll do the best I can to fix those problems in the course material. So now that you know all the boring stuff for CSS Grid, let's do the really cool stuff and get into the code. So I'll see you all in the next video.